Amy Robsart didn't simply fall down a staircase. She died at the exact moment her husband, Robert Dudley, needed her out of the way to chase the most dangerous dream in Tudor England, the Queen herself. Her body was found with a broken neck in an empty house with no servants present, a scene so convenient that it looked less like an accident and more like a carefully staged removal. Her death cleared the single obstacle standing between Dudley and royal power. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Tudor ambition had no place for a living wife, and Amy Robsart became the woman quietly buried so her husband could climb. What looked like a tragic fall has haunted English history for centuries, not because it was sad, but because it was suspiciously useful. Amy Robsart was born in June 1532 into a world that was stable, wealthy, and fiercely Protestant. She was not a courtier, but she was the very top tier of the country gentry. She was the only legitimate child of Sir John Robsart, a formidable landowner and the Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk. In the economic calculus of Tudor marriage, Amy was a gold mine. Her father owned vast estates in Norfolk, Sidderstone, Stanfield, Newton. Because she had no brothers, under English common law, she was destined to inherit it all. In an era where land was the only real currency, Amy Robsart walked through the world with a heavy purse attached to her belt. But to understand her value, one must understand the instability of the times. The mid-16th century was a period of violent flux. The old nobility, ancient families with armies, were being displaced by new men, bureaucrats and merchants rising through wealth and Protestant zeal. Amy represented this new stability, grounded, landed, and religiously reformist. This wealth was not merely accumulated through old feudal dues. It was the product of the greatest transfer of property in English history, the dissolution of the monasteries. Sir John Robsart was a beneficiary of this upheaval, a man who had navigated the religious revolution to secure former church lands for his own portfolio. The Robsart fortune was built on the backbone of the English economy, wool. In the 1530s and 40s, the enclosure movement was transforming the countryside, turning arable farmland into enclosed pastures for sheep. Wool was the oil of the Tudor era, the primary export that kept the kingdom afloat. Amy was not just an heiress to dirt and stone, she was the heiress to a modern agrarian capitalist engine. Her marriage to a Dudley wasn't just a social climb for her, it was a cash injection for them, funded by the very economic shifts that were modernizing England. She grew up at Stanfield Hall, a moated manor house. She was educated, literate, and raised with the expectation that she would manage a large household. She was trained in the business of land management, the sale of wool, and the navigation of local politics. She was a woman of agency. So how did this wealthy heiress cross paths with the son of the most dangerous man in England? The year was 1549. England was burning. The Ket's rebellion had exploded in Norfolk. It was a massive uprising of commoners against the enclosure of public lands by wealthy landowners. The rebels, led by Robert Ket, were tearing down fences, storming manors, and demanding justice. Sir John Robsart, as a prominent landowner, was a target. He fled his home for safety. At the same time, the crown sent an army to crush the rebellion. Leading that army was John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, later the Duke of Northumberland. Riding beside him was his young 17-year-old son, Robert Dudley. It is highly probable that in the chaos of this summer, amidst the smoke of burning fences and the marshalling of troops, the Robsarts and the Dudleys intersected. Perhaps Sir John sought the protection of the Earl's army. Robert Dudley, at 17, was already a force of nature. Tall, athletic, with a dark, brooding charisma that would later captivate a queen, He was the fifth son of a rising dynasty. But being a fifth son meant he was technically poor. The Dudley fortune would go to the eldest. Robert had a famous name but empty pockets. Amy Robsart, conversely, had the money but lacked the high-ranking title. It was on paper a perfect merger. The Robsart wealth would fund Robert's ambition. The Dudley title would elevate Amy's social standing. But the historical record suggests something rarer and more dangerous than a business deal occurred. They actually fell in love. On June 4th, 1550, less than a year after the rebellion was crushed, Robert Dudley and Amy Robsart were married at the Royal Palace of Sheen in Richmond. The guest list was staggering. King Edward VI, the boy king, attended the wedding. This was a signal of the immense power the Dudley family wielded at the time. Robert's father effectively ruled England as the Lord President of the Council. However, the political elite looked at this union with sneering disdain. William Cecil, the future chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth, and a man who would become Robert Dudley's lifelong nemesis, described the union in a note with two brutal words: nuptia carnales, a carnal marriage. In the 21st century, marrying for sexual attraction is the norm. In the 16th century, among the aristocracy, it was considered a weakness. It implied a lack of discipline. It meant you were thinking with your body, not your brain. Cecil was judging them. He saw a young, hot-blooded couple who couldn't wait to be together, bypassing more strategic alliances with foreign powers or higher nobility. To the pragmatic minds ruling England, a man who married for love was a man who could not control his passions, a dangerous trait for someone close to power. For a brief window, they were the golden couple of the Edwardian court. They were both 17. They were beautiful, wealthy, thanks to Amy's dowry, and position at the very heart of power. They divided their time between the glittering court in London and the quiet, wealthy estates in Norfolk. But the wheel of fortune in Tudor England turned with terrifying speed. In 1553, the young King Edward VI lay dying of tuberculosis. The stability of the realm collapsed. Robert's father, the Duke of Northumberland, knew that if Edward's Catholic half-sister Mary took the throne, the Protestant Dudleys would be destroyed. So he concocted a desperate, treasonous plan. He persuaded the dying king to bypass Mary and name his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his successor. To seal the deal, the Duke married his other son, Guilford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey. When the king died, the Dudleys made their move. They proclaimed Jane Grey the Queen of England. Robert Dudley, just 21 years old, rode out at the head of 300 horsemen to capture Mary Tudor and bring her to the Tower. He failed. The country rallied to Mary. The Dudley coup crumbled in just 9 days. The retribution was absolute. The Duke of Northumberland was arrested. Guilford Dudley was arrested. Lady Jane Grey was arrested. And Robert Dudley, the Golden Boy, was hunted down, captured, and thrown into the Beauchamp Tower within the fortress of the Tower of London. He was condemned to die. This is the moment where we see the true mettle of Amy Robsart. While Robert sat in a stone cell carving his name into the wall, a carving you can still see today, Robert D.V. Lee, waiting for the executioner's axe, his fair-weather friends vanished. The Dudley name was poison. To be associated with them was to risk treason charges. Amy Robsart did not vanish. She was just 21 years old. Her husband was a convicted traitor. Her father-in-law had just been beheaded on Tower Hill. Her brother-in-law was next. The crown had seized all of Robert's lands and assets. Amy went to work. We have evidence that she petitioned the authorities. She managed the few resources they had left. She likely traveled to London to visit him, navigating a city that hated the name Dudley. While Robert was locked in a cell with his brothers, watching from the window as Lady Jane Grey was led to the scaffold, Amy was his lifeline to the outside world. It is crucial to note, Robert Dudley spent his formative years in a dungeon, expecting to die. This trauma shaped him. It made him desperate, harder, and relentlessly ambitious. He swore that if he ever got out, he would never be powerless again. And who was sharing that trauma? Not Amy. Inside the tower, there was another high-ranking prisoner, a young, red-headed princess named Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the future queen, was also imprisoned by her sister Mary. She and Robert Dudley were held in the same fortress at the same time, facing the same threat of execution. They were both Protestants, both brilliant, both terrified. Historians speculate that their bond, the intense psychic connection that would baffle Europe for decades, was forged here in the shadow of death. While Amy was outside, dutifully managing the accounts and pleading for his life, Robert was inside, bonding with the woman who would become his obsession. In late 1554, after 18 months of imprisonment, Robert Dudley was released. He was alive, but he was socially dead. He was stripped of his titles. He had no job, no land, and no influence. He returned to Amy. Here, the political machinery of the attainder is vital to understand. When Robert was convicted, he was attainted. His blood was considered corrupt. He could not own property. He could not inherit. He was a non-person in the eyes of the law. This meant that for the next 3 years, the dynamic of their marriage inverted completely. The proud Robert Dudley was now entirely dependent on his wife's money. They lived at the Robsart family estates. They sold Amy's wool to pay his debts. They lived off the charity of her father. For a man of Robert's ego, this must have been humiliating. He was a courtier, forced to play the role of a country gentleman. He spent these years brooding, hawking, and plotting his return. Amy, by all accounts, was content. She had her husband back. They were away from the toxic politics of London. This was the life she was born for, managing a great estate surrounded by family. But Robert was merely biding his time. He was watching the horizon, waiting for Queen Mary to die. On November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary I died. The bells rang out across London. Elizabeth I ascended the throne. The moment Elizabeth became queen, she sent for Robert Dudley. He didn't walk to London, he galloped. He was immediately appointed Master of the Horse, a prestigious position that required him to be physically near the Queen at all times. He was given rooms next to hers. He was suddenly the most influential man in the realm. And Amy? Amy did not go to court. This is the second great mystery. Why? Was she not invited? Did she refuse to go, or did Robert forbid it? The court of Elizabeth I was a place of high fashion, flirtation, and intellectual sparring. Robert fit in perfectly. Amy, with her country education and lack of courtly polish, may have felt out of place. Or perhaps Robert, realizing that his chemistry with the Virgin Queen was his ticket to power, knew that a wife would be a distraction. We must also understand the courtly love dynamic Elizabeth was establishing. She ruled as a solitary woman in a man's world. To maintain power, she turned her court into a stage where powerful men wooed her. This wasn't just romance, it was a mechanism of control. By keeping men like Dudley, Pickering, and foreign princes hoping for her hand, she kept them loyal. Amy Robsart was a glitch in this system. A master of the horse who was visibly married broke the illusion that the queen was the only woman who mattered. Amy remained in the country, but she didn't stay at her family home. She began a strange nomadic existence. She moved from one rented manor house to another, staying with friends of Robert's, the Hydes, the Verneys, and finally, the Forsters at Cumnor Place. She was being hidden. While Robert was dancing with the Queen and collecting titles, Amy was ordering dresses from London tailors, trying to maintain the appearance of a noblewoman. We have a letter from this period written by Amy to her tailor that is devastating in its subtext. In the letter, she orders a velvet gown with a collar of Spanish silk. The irony is cruel. While she sat in the countryside ordering Spanish fabric, the Spanish ambassador was in London plotting her husband's downfall. The letter reveals a woman desperately trying to look the part of a courtier's wife, perhaps hoping that a new gown would earn her a summons to London, a summons that never came. She mentions Robert with affection, but it is the affection of a woman writing about a ghost. By 1559, the separation was absolute. They almost never saw each other, and the whispers began. The Spanish ambassador de Feria wrote home, "Lord Robert has come so much into favor that he does whatever he likes with affairs, and it is even said that Her Majesty visits him in his chamber day and night." The gossip turned darker. People began to say that Robert was planning to divorce Amy. Others said he would poison her. And then the rumors reached Amy herself. The geopolitical stakes were incredibly high. Spain and France were watching closely. If Elizabeth married Robert Dudley, a man they considered a heretic and an upstart, it would signal a radical militaristic Protestant England. The ambassadors weren't just gossiping, they were warning their kings that King Robert would mean war. Amy Robsart was the only firewall preventing this shift in the European balance of power. This situation triggered the activation of an international diplomatic spy ring. It wasn't just idle chatter, it was high-stakes espionage. The new Spanish ambassador, Alvaro de la Quadra, a cunning bishop who served as King Philip II's eyes in London, began dispatching encrypted letters to Spain detailing the Dudley problem. He was cultivating sources deep within the palace. Here we must look at the dark role of William Cecil. Cecil was the Queen's secretary, the most prudent man in England. He viewed Dudley's ambition as a chaotic force that could destroy the state. Just weeks before Amy's death, Cecil had a private, terrifying conversation with the Spanish ambassador de Quadra. In a moment of calculated candor, Cecil whispered that Robert Dudley was thinking of killing his wife. He explicitly stated that Amy was quite well, but that they were spreading rumors of her illness to prepare the public for her death. This conversation is the smoking gun for those who believe in a conspiracy. Why did the most powerful minister in England predict the murder of a noblewoman weeks before it happened? Was Cecil merely observing, or was he setting the stage? By telling the Spanish ambassador that Dudley was planning a murder, Cecil ensured that if Amy did die, Robert would be instantly blamed and ruined. It was a master class in Machiavellian chess. In Paris, the English ambassador Nicholas Throckmorton was hearing the same terrifying rumors from the French court. The French courtiers were openly laughing at the English scandal, joking that the Queen of England would marry her horsemaster as soon as he had murdered his wife. Throckmorton wrote back to Cecil in a panic, warning that the Queen's reputation in Europe was being shredded. The pressure was building not just in Cumnor, but in the chancelleries of Madrid and Paris. The world was waiting for Amy to die. In the months leading up to September 1560, Amy's mental state began to deteriorate. She reportedly told her maid that she prayed to God to deliver her from her desperation. She knew she was the obstacle. She knew the whole world was watching her, waiting for her to disappear. She was wealthy. She was the wife of the Queen's favorite, but she was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the wife. The only thing standing between Robert Dudley and the crown of England, and in the Tudor Game of Thrones, obstacles have a way of being removed. The board was set. The pieces were in place. The rumors had written the script long before the event actually occurred. And when the inevitable finally happened, it took place at Cumnor Place. To understand the mystery, one must visualize the house. Cumnor Place was not a cozy home. It was a converted monastic grange. It was a relic of the old religious order, dark, sprawling, and maze-like. It was rented by Anthony Forster, a man who owed his livelihood to Robert Dudley. The specific location of the death is critical, the stone spiral staircase. In Tudor architecture, these stairs were designed for utility, not comfort. They were often narrow, steep, and made of uneven stone. A fall down such stairs was certainly dangerous. However, these were not the grand, sweeping wooden staircases of later centuries, where one might tumble dramatically. These were tight, enclosed spirals. To fall down a spiral staircase and break one's neck requires a specific kind of violence. It is difficult to gain enough momentum to shatter bone in such a confined space unless one is pushed or unless the body is thrown. The very architecture of the house argues against a simple slip. When the whispers of a malady turned into the violence of a broken neck, it did not bring relief to the ambitious husband. It brought a tidal wave. The private tragedy of a lonely wife instantly mutated into a public crisis for the most powerful man in England. The silence of the house was about to be broken by the frantic scratching of quills, the galloping of horses, and the desperate machinery of political survival. News of death travels differently than news of war. It is quieter, but it cuts deeper. When the messenger from Cumnor Place finally spurred his exhausted horse through the gates of Windsor Castle, he was carrying a bomb that would detonate in the heart of the English court. Robert Dudley was likely in his chambers, or perhaps with the Queen, when he received the word, "Amy is dead, neck broken, found at the bottom of the stairs." His reaction in this precise moment is the most scrutinized behavior of his life. A grieving husband might have called for a fresh horse. He might have ridden through the night, driven by shock and denial, to hold his wife's body, to demand answers from the servants, to weep over her corpse. Robert Dudley did none of these things. He did not go to Cumnor. In fact, he would never go to Cumnor Place again. He would never see Amy's body. Instead, Robert Dudley did what a politician does when the walls are closing in. He went into damage control. He stayed at Windsor, fortified by the Queen's favor, and he sent a fixer. Robert immediately dispatched his cousin and trusted confidant, Thomas Blount, to Oxfordshire. Blount's mission was ostensibly to investigate the death and comfort the household, but in reality his mission was intelligence gathering and public relations management. We know this because we have the letters. The correspondence between Robert Dudley and Thomas Blount in the days following Amy's death is one of the most fascinating archives in Tudor history. These are not the letters of a heartbroken widower. They are the letters of a terrified man. Dudley's first letter to Blount is frantic. He writes, "The malicious world will comment." This phrase is the key to his psyche. He wasn't thinking about Amy. He was thinking about the malicious world, the enemies at court, the Spanish ambassadors, the gossips in the London taverns who were already calling him a murderer. He knew exactly what this looked like. He knew that the convenient death of his wife looked like a professional hit. He instructed Blount to get to the bottom of the matter and to ensure that the coroner's inquest was rigorous. This is a critical point for those who believe Dudley is innocent. He didn't ask for a cover-up. He asked for the truth. He wrote, "I seek chiefly truth in this case, without respect to any favor to be showed to me." Why? Because Robert Dudley was a brilliant strategist. He knew that a hasty, hushed-up investigation would only prove his guilt in the eyes of the public. He needed a jury to publicly declare him innocent. He needed total exoneration, or he could never marry the Queen. When Thomas Blount arrived at Cumnor Place, he began to interview the household. He found a house in chaos. The servants were confused. The neighbors were suspicious. Blount focused his attention on the servants who had returned from the fair. He asked them, was there any chance of an intruder? Was there any sign of a struggle? The servants were adamant. No, the doors were secure. The only people in the house were the ladies in the separate wing, and they had heard nothing. Then Blount interviewed Amy's maid, Mrs. Pinto. This interview provides us with a glimpse into Amy's final days. Mrs. Pinto revealed that Amy had been obsessed with delivering herself from desperation. Blount jumped on this. He asked, might she have had an evil intent upon herself? He was probing for the suicide narrative. If Amy had killed herself, it was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder. It would clear Robert of the crime of homicide. But Mrs. Pinto shook her head. She defended her mistress's soul. She insisted that Amy was a good Christian woman who would never commit the mortal sin of suicide. Suicide in the 16th century was not just a death. It was a crime against God. The body would be staked through the heart and buried at a crossroads. The family's assets would be seized by the crown. Mrs. Pinto was protecting Amy's reputation even in death. So Blount was left with a puzzle. It wasn't a break-in. The maid denied suicide. And yet, she was dead at the bottom of the stairs with her hood still on. Dudley's next move was a masterstroke of legal manipulation. He wrote to Blount regarding the selection of the jury for the coroner's inquest. Usually, a powerful lord would pack a jury with his own men, tenants, friends, people on his payroll, to ensure a favorable verdict. Dudley did the opposite. He told Blount to find discreet and substantial men, but he specifically suggested that the jury should include men who disliked Anthony Forster, the tenant of Cumnor Place, and Dudley's man. He wanted men who had no reason to do Robert Dudley any favors. He wanted a hostile jury. Why? Because a verdict of innocent from a jury of friends means nothing. But a verdict of innocent from a jury of enemies, that is unassailable. That is proof. The inquest was held. 15 men from the local area were sworn in. They examined the body. They looked at the stairs. They heard the testimony about the empty house. It is here that the history books usually go dark. For centuries, we didn't have the transcript of this inquest. We only knew the result. After rigorous debate, the jury returned a verdict of infortunium, misfortune, accidental death. They ruled that Amy Robsart, being alone in a certain chamber, accidentally fell precipitously down. Legally, Robert was in the clear. The law had spoken. It was an accident. But politically, he was destroyed. The verdict of accident convinced absolutely no one. The public didn't have the forensic details. They had the narrative, and the narrative was perfect. The Queen's lover kills his wife to seize the crown. In the taverns of London, preachers gave sermons hinting at the crime. The Spanish ambassador wrote gleefully to King Philip. The cry is that they were thinking of destroying Lord Robert's wife. She was found dead on the stairs with her neck broken, although it was a short flight. Note the skepticism. Although it was a short flight, even in 1560, people knew that falling down 8 steps rarely snaps a spine like a twig. At court, the atmosphere turned icy. Queen Elizabeth, who had been so close to Robert, suddenly had to distance herself. She was a master of optics. She could not be seen holding the hand of a man labeled a wife killer. The plans for a wedding, if there ever were concrete plans, were shelved. Even the French court mocked the situation. Queen Catherine de' Medici reportedly sneered, "She was rich enough," implying that her wealth was the only reason she had been tolerated this long, and now that Dudley had power, she was disposable. Robert Dudley remained her favorite. He remained the master of the horse. But the glass ceiling had been installed. He could be her lover, her friend, her advisor. But he could never be her king. Amy Robsart, in dying, had checkmated him. Since Robert could not go to the funeral, custom dictated that the immediate family did not attend the burial to avoid unseemly displays of emotion, but his absence was interpreted as guilt. He threw money at the problem. He ordered a funeral for Amy that was fit for a princess. It was held at the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. It cost over £2,000. In modern currency, that is hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a massive Baroque spectacle of black velvet, heraldic banners, and professional mourners. He invited the entire University of Oxford. He paid for mourning clothes for dozens of poor women, a traditional act of charity. He practically bankrupted himself to show the world how much he honored his beloved wife. But there was a strange cold hollowness to this grand gesture. Despite the fortune spent on the ceremony, Robert Dudley did not pay for a tomb. He did not commission a stone effigy, which was standard practice for a woman of her rank. Amy was buried beneath the floor stones of the choir, and the location was left unmarked. It was as if he wanted to give her a royal exit, but ensure she left no physical trace behind. He was willing to pay for the spectacle of grief, but he was not willing to carve her name into stone for posterity. It was a propaganda funeral, designed to silence the critics, not to honor the dead. Even the theater had a crack in it. The sermon was preached by Dr. Francis Babington, one of Dudley's chaplains. It was meant to be a eulogy praising Amy's virtue and lamenting the tragic accident. But at one point, perhaps a slip of the tongue, or perhaps a Freudian slip born of nervousness, Dr. Babington referred to Amy as having been pitifully slain. Slain, not fallen, not died, slain. The congregation froze. The word hung in the air. Even the man paid to defend her death couldn't stick to the script. The ghost of Amy Robsart refused to stay buried. 7 years later, in 1567, the scandal erupted again. Amy's half-brother, John Appleyard, surfaced. Appleyard had been paid off by Dudley after the death, given positions and money. But he had squandered it. Now destitute, he tried to play the Amy card. He began whispering that he had not been satisfied with the jury's verdict. He claimed that he had buried the truth for money, but his conscience was now clear. He hinted that he had evidence of foul play. However, the Appleyard incident was not merely the desperate act of a broke relative. It was a symptom of a much larger disease in the English court: factional warfare. By 1567, the court was split. On one side stood Robert Dudley, now Earl of Leicester, the progressive Protestant leader. On the other stood the old nobility, led by the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Sussex. They hated Dudley. They viewed him as a parvenu, an upstart who had bewitched the Queen. They saw Appleyard as a weapon. It is highly likely that Appleyard was encouraged, if not funded, by Dudley's enemies to resuscitate the scandal. They wanted to use Amy's corpse to block Dudley from becoming the Lord Protector of the realm. Dudley's reaction was swift and terrifying. He didn't have Appleyard killed. That would have been too obvious. He had the Privy Council summon Appleyard. They brought him into a room with the most powerful men in England, Cecil, the Earl of Arundel, and Dudley himself. They demanded he produce this evidence. Appleyard crumbled. Confronted by the full weight of the state, he recanted. He admitted he had just wanted money. He was thrown into Fleet Prison to rot for a while, a broken man. But the damage was done. The fact that Amy's own brother believed she was murdered, or at least believed the story was plausible enough to use for blackmail, kept the wound open. For nearly 5 centuries, the dust settled over the case. The witnesses died, the house crumbled, and the truth seemed lost to the rot of time. We were left with nothing but gossip and a verdict of misfortune that felt like a cover-up. But history has a way of burying its secrets shallowly. In 2008, the silence was finally broken, not by a new testimony, but by a misfiled piece of parchment that would turn the accidental fall theory into a forensic impossibility. The era of speculation ended. The era of forensics had begun. History is usually written in ink, but sometimes it is rewritten by a filing error. For centuries, the truth about Amy Robsart was obscured by rumors, lost documents, and romantic fiction. We knew the verdict, death by misfortune, but we did not have the autopsy. In 2008, Dr. Stephen Gunn of Merton College, Oxford, was conducting a prosaic study on accidental deaths in Tudor England. He was scrolling through a roll of parchment known as a coroner's roll, specifically looking for data on people who had fallen off carts or been kicked by horses. He was not looking for royalty. He was not looking for murder. He found a file catalogued under Sussex. But as he read the Latin text, he realized the scribe had made a mistake 448 years ago. The location was not Sussex. It was Cumnor, near Oxford. His eyes scanned the faded script until they hit the words, Lady Amy Robsart. He was holding the original primary source coroner's report, dated August 1561, referencing the death in September 1560. It was the holy grail of Elizabethan cold cases. Dr. Gunn translated the text. The document confirmed the broken neck, cervical fracture. But then, it listed details that had been erased from the public consciousness for nearly half a millennium. The coroner had found two distinct impacts on her head. The first was a blow to the side of the head, approximately 1/4 inch deep. The second was a far more severe blow, approximately 2 inches deep. The historian froze. 2 inches? A 2-inch deep wound in the skull is catastrophic. In modern forensic terms, this is the kind of trauma associated with a high-velocity impact, being struck by a baseball bat, being thrown from a moving vehicle, or being bludgeoned with a heavy object like a rock or a mace. In the 16th century, this was the kind of wound seen on a battlefield, caused by a poleaxe or a warhammer, not a domestic slip and fall. The staircase at Cumnor Place was described as a pair of stairs, which in Tudor terminology meant a flight connecting two landings. It was a stone spiral. There were only about 8 steps involved in the final descent. Can you get a 2-inch deep skull puncture from tripping down 8 steps? It is physically possible, but statistically highly improbable. If she had fallen and hit the sharp edge of a stone step with the full weight of her body accelerating downwards, it could happen. But combined with the fact that her hood was still on her head, the new evidence created a paradox. The hood suggests a gentle placement or a sudden collapse where the head did not tumble violently. The wound suggests extreme bone-shattering violence. How do you get hit in the head hard enough to penetrate the skull 2 inches, yet not knock your hat off? This discovery forced historians to reopen the 4 doors of death. Let us walk through them one last time with the new evidence in hand. First, the suicide theory. The theory holds that Amy was depressed, ill, and knew her husband wanted to marry the queen. She sent the servants away to ensure she wouldn't be stopped, then threw herself down the stairs. The evidence for this is Mrs. Pinto's testimony about Amy praying to be delivered from desperation and the clearing of the house. However, the physics argue against it. Suicide by jumping down a short flight of stairs is incredibly difficult. You are more likely to break a leg or a collarbone than to snap your neck and puncture your skull. To achieve that level of damage, she would have had to dive headfirst with immense force. And again, would the hood stay on? Furthermore, suicide was a mortal sin. If she wanted to die, poison was easier and cleaner. Second, the assassination theory. The theory suggests Robert Dudley, driven by ambition and lust, ordered his men to kill her. His tenant, Anthony Forster, or perhaps his man Sir Richard Verney, did the deed. They waited for the house to empty, struck her on the head, broke her neck, and staged the fall. The motive is clear, and the 2-inch wound looks exactly like a blow from a weapon. The undisturbed hood suggests the body was staged after death. But the political counter-argument is strong. Robert was a lawyer's son. He knew that a violent death would look suspicious. Why stage a violent accident that invites a coroner's inquest when poison would have been cleaner? As the historian William Camden later wrote, he was too good a lawyer to be so bad a criminal. Third, the frame job theory. This is the house of cards theory. William Cecil, the Queen's secretary, hated Dudley and feared his influence. Cecil knew the rumors and even told the Spanish ambassador, "She is as good as dead," weeks before she died. Did Cecil hire agents to kill Amy and make it look like Dudley did it? It worked perfectly. The death occurred at the precise moment it was most damaging to Dudley. It effectively canceled Dudley as a marriage prospect. But there is no paper trail. Cecil was ruthless, but assassination of a noblewoman was a line few crossed. It is a compelling narrative, but it relies on speculation. Fourth, the medical accident theory. This hypothesis, proposed in 1956 by Dr. Ian Aird, suggests that Amy suffered from a malady in the breast, likely cancer. If the disease had metastasized, her bones would have become brittle. A simple stumble on the stairs could have caused her cervical vertebra to snap under the weight of her own head, dropping her instantly. This explains the undisturbed hood, but it fails to resolve the violence of the skull fracture. A collapse creates a break. It does not create a 2-inch puncture consistent with a blow from a weapon. So we are left with a haunting paradox. The forensics suggest a murder weapon. The clothing suggests a tragic fall. The politics suggest a professional hit. While the medical event offers a plausible tragedy, the murder theory remains immortal because of the timing. She died at the precise nanosecond her death was required for her husband's ambition, yet she died in a manner that destroyed that ambition forever. In the end, Amy Robsart achieved in death what she could not in life. She controlled the fate of England. Because of her death, Elizabeth I never married Robert Dudley. She flirted with him, she loved him, she kept him by her side until he died in 1588. But she never shared her throne. Amy's corpse lay between them like a sword. This forced Elizabeth to become the Virgin Queen, forcing her to rule alone. Amy Robsart was buried in the choir of St. Mary's in Oxford. Her tomb was eventually disturbed and lost during renovations, her bones scattered. But her legacy is the English monarchy itself. She was the sacrificial lamb upon which the Elizabethan era was built. The sun set on Cumnor Place that Sunday in 1560, and when it rose, the world had changed. The house is gone now, demolished to the foundations. The stones are lost, but the mystery remains echoing in the archives, whispering from a 2-inch wound in a dusty report, "I was here, I mattered, and you will never know the truth." The forensic evidence tells us how she might have died, but it cannot tell us why it mattered so enduringly. Whether by murder, suicide, or a freak medical accident, the physical trauma to Amy's skull was only the initial impact. The secondary trauma was inflicted on the timeline of England itself. The inquest closed the file, but it could not close the wound in the public consciousness. As the immediate shock faded, a long, cold shadow stretched out from Cumnor Place, darkening the golden age for decades to come, and forcing a queen to walk a solitary path. Amy Robsart was buried, but she refused to leave the stage. In the high-stakes theater of the Tudor court, Her death had changed the script forever. The problem of Amy didn't end with the coroner's verdict. It merely shifted forms. She became a ghost, a political weapon, and finally a legend that would outlive the very stones of the house where she died. To understand the full magnitude of that Sunday in September, we must look at what happened to the survivors. The husband who couldn't be king, the queen who ruled alone, and the house that was cursed by memory. Robert Dudley survived the scandal, but he was marked by it. He remained Queen Elizabeth's favorite, her sweet Robin, her eyes. But the possibility of marriage was legally and politically dead. Yet Robert was a man of relentless optimism. He spent the next 15 years trying to rehabilitate his image, trying to prove to the world and to Elizabeth that he was more than a wife killer. This culminated in 1575, 15 years after Amy's death, in the single most extravagant event of the Elizabethan era, the Kenilworth festivities. Robert had been granted Kenilworth Castle by the Queen. He transformed it into a Renaissance palace. In July 1575, he hosted Elizabeth for 19 days of feasting, fireworks, pageants, and hunting. It was a final desperate proposal. He nearly bankrupted himself to show her that he could be a king consort, but Amy was the invisible guest at the feast. Every foreign ambassador watching the spectacle remembered the dead wife. They whispered that a man who couldn't protect his first wife shouldn't be trusted with the Queen. Elizabeth, astute as ever, enjoyed the party, but she refused the proposal. She famously told him that she would have no master but herself. The ghost of Cumnor Place had effectively vetoed the marriage from the grave. Frustrated and realizing the Queen would never marry him, Robert Dudley made a fatal mistake. He fell in love again. In 1578, he secretly married Lettice Knollys. Lettice was the Queen's cousin, and she was everything Amy was not: a high-ranking courtier, fiercely ambitious, and sexually charismatic. She was known as the she-wolf. When Elizabeth found out about the marriage, her rage was volcanic. It wasn't just jealousy, it was betrayal. Robert had proven the old rumors true. He was a man who made secret, convenient marriages. Elizabeth banished Lettice from court forever. She nicknamed her that she-wolf and never spoke her name again. It is a bitter irony. Robert Dudley was suspected of killing his first wife to marry the Queen, but he ended up losing the Queen because he married a second wife. He died in 1588, shortly after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth locked herself in her room for days, clutching his final letter, which she labeled his last letter and kept in her bedside treasure box until she died. While the court moved on, Cumnor Place began to die. After the inquest, the house acquired a dark reputation. The locals in Oxfordshire avoided it. They whispered that Madame Dudley walked the halls. The legend of the ghost grew so intense that it became a tangible problem for the tenants. Servants refused to work there. People reported seeing a white shape on the stairs, the fatal stairs. They heard the snap of a neck in the silence of the night. The haunting became so disruptive that, according to local folklore, 9 parsons from Oxford were called in to perform an exorcism. They reportedly laid Amy's spirit in a pond nearby, promising she would not return until the pond dried up. But the house was doomed. No one wanted to live in a murder scene. The owners, the Forster family, eventually abandoned it. The grand manor where Amy had spent her final lonely days began to rot. The roof collapsed. The gardens were choked with weeds. In 1810, the ruins were finally pulled down. The stones were carted away to build a local church. Today, nothing remains of Cumnor Place but a low wall and a few foundation stones hidden in the grass. The physical evidence of the crime, the staircase, the landing, the geography of the fall, was erased by time and superstition. For 2 centuries, Amy Robsart was a footnote. Then, in 1821, she was resurrected by the most famous novelist of the 19th century, Sir Walter Scott. Scott wrote Kenilworth, a historical romance that became a global bestseller. But Scott wasn't a historian. He was a storyteller. He took the black legend of Robert Dudley and amplified it. In Scott's version, Amy is a tragic, saintly heroine. She is lured to Cumnor Place, imprisoned, and then murdered by a trap-door mechanism on the stairs rigged by the villainous Sir Richard Varney. The novel was so popular that it overwrote history. People stopped believing in the accident or the illness. They wanted the melodrama. They wanted the trapdoor. Scott cemented the image of Amy Robsart as the ultimate victim of male ambition, the lamb sacrificed for the lion, Dudley. As we look back at the case from the vantage point of 2026, with our modern forensic understanding of the 2-inch wound and the undisturbed hood, Amy Robsart transforms from a victim into a pivot point of history. If Amy Robsart had lived, if she had simply divorced Robert, or if she had been healthy and produced an heir, the history of the world would be unrecognizable. If she had lived, Robert Dudley would have remained a married man. The scandal would not have occurred. Elizabeth might have eventually married a foreign prince, perhaps the Duke of Anjou, to secure an alliance. If she had died of natural causes, Robert would have been a sorrowful widower. The path to marrying Elizabeth would have been clear. The Dudley dynasty might have taken the throne. But because she died suspiciously, she froze the timeline. She created a stalemate. Her death forced Elizabeth I to navigate a path of solitude. It created the political environment where the virgin queen persona became necessary for survival. Elizabeth could not marry her love because he was tainted. She would not marry a foreigner because her people hated them. So, she married England. The Golden Age, Shakespeare, the defeat of the Armada, the exploration of the New World, happened under a queen who ruled alone. And she ruled alone because, on a Sunday in September 1560, a woman fell down 8 steps and didn't lose her hood. Amy Robsart was not just a body at the bottom of the stairs. She was the unintended architect of the Elizabethan age. In the end, the mystery of Cumnor Place isn't just who done it. The mystery is how a quiet, country gentlewoman with no army and no political office managed to alter the destiny of an empire simply by dying at the wrong time, in the wrong way. The verdict of the coroner was misfortune. The verdict of history is consequence. In the next video, we face a death far more brutal than a fall down a staircase. A death built on fire, screams, and religious vengeance. John Hooper's execution was far more agonizing than you imagine. Burned alive by Bloody Mary. If you thought Amy Robsart's end was chilling, wait until you witness what it meant to die in flames under Mary I. Subscribe, stay with us, and prepare for the next descent into Tudor terror.